Is the ETF SCHD as great as everybody says it is, or is it just a regular old ETF? Well, in today's video, I'm going to be giving you a deep dive into SCHD by going over their financial ratios, sectors they're invested in, how many funds they have, and much more. And at the end of the video, I'll also calculate how much you could potentially make if you did invest into SCHD. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So the first thing to know is what even is SCHD. SCHD is a dividend-paying ETF that before fees and expenses tracks the Dow Jones US 100 Dividend Index. Now, because SCHD does track this fund, lots of the companies in SCHD also come from this dividend fund. SCHD is designed to measure the performance of these high-yielding dividend stocks issued by these US companies that have a track record of paying dividends consecutively. To do this, SCHD actually screens their stocks before they let any into this ETF, and they do this by looking at their cash flow to debt ratio, return on equity, dividend growth, and their dividend yield. So what do these terms actually mean? Cash flow to debt ratio is basically a term where it takes the company's operational cash flow and sees how that can pay off its debt. The term return on equity is basically just a gauge to determine the company's profitability. Dividend yield is basically the dividend payout relative to the actual market value of the share of that company. And dividend growth rate is how the dividend is changing over time, and preferably that'll be an increasing dividend payout year over year. SCHD also screens companies for 10 years of consecutive dividend payouts. Now with these screenings, what companies are actually part of this ETF? Well, it turns out there's actually 102 companies that are part of SCHD. Now on this graph, you can actually see the top 10 biggest holdings of the companies in SCHD. Very well-known companies like Cisco, Home Depot, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, and Verizon, and then with Amgen being the highest at 4.46% of the total size of SCHD. And with the companies on this list, all of them have a really good dividend yield, and most importantly, they pay them consecutively over the years. Now, a quick thing to point out is that the sectors and the companies in SCHD does change frequently, so this stuff may be outdated if you're watching a little bit in the future. Not only does SCHD have really good companies, but they also try to diversify across different sectors as well. And on this table, we can actually see what sectors SCHD has and which ones rank the highest among the others. And the three biggest sectors in SCHD are financial services, which are 15.43% of the ETF, healthcare, which is 16.07%, and industrials, which make up 17.48%. And this is why people like SCHD so much, because it's diversified across tons of different sectors and it has a lot of good companies inside of it. And as a result of this, the dividend yield for SCHD is 3.53%, which is really high compared to most other ETFs. And the dividends for this ETF are paid every quarter or every 3 months. Now let's take a look at how SCHD actually performed. SCHD's inception date was back in 2011, and during this time, the price went from in the mid-20s all the way up to around $80 at the high point. Now, right now, it's currently up 189% all time. Now, another thing to point out is that the SCHD trend upwards has been relatively consistent since it started back in 2011. The only most notable change was back in 2020 when we did have that crash. And this is why a lot of people like SCHD. Not only do you have really good companies in it, you have a lot of diversification, but you also have great appreciation on the ETF. And another thing to point out is that 189% doesn't even factor in the dividend yield that you gain on top of this. This is just the ETF appreciation over the years. You'll often see a lot of people having SCHD in long-term accounts or even in their Roth IRAs for retirement. Now, another table I want to show you is just SCHD's dividend history over time. So this table shows you the dividend growth history from 2011 all the way up to 2022. And as we can see, besides from 2011, which had a year-end yield of 0.66%, the year-end yield for all the years after that were pretty high, all over around 3.5%, roughly. Now, the actual average yield for all these years is 3.21%, but if you take out that 2011 year that had 0.66%, the actual average for that is 3.44%. So even though SCHD dividend growth is not growing year after year, you are getting a really good average over these years of about 3.44%. Now let's use a calculator to see how much you could approximately make if you did invest your money into SCHD, and I'll just use a reasonable amount, which is $10,000, to see where that could go in the next 20 years. So this is a simple dividend calculator that you can use, and I'll have this linked in the description if you want to play around with the numbers. So we're going to be able to see a rough estimate of how much you can make if you did invest into SCHD, and we'll start off with $10,000. Now we're going to change the distribution frequency to quarterly because that's how SCHD pays their dividends. They pay it quarterly or every 3 months. Now we're going to leave DRIP turned on to yes, and that's basically meaning that any dividends that you receive from SCHD will be invested back into the ETF that you do have as more shares. Now I know the dividend yield is higher than I'm going to use, but I'm going to use 3.44% because that was the average dividend yield across all the years that SCHD has been around. And then we're just going to have 20 years stay the same, and then the annual dividend amount increase and the share appreciation will just stay the same. And we can always change these numbers to play around with it because we don't really know what SCHD is going to do in the future. So once we hit calculate dividends, we can scroll down to get a rough estimate of how much we could make, and that's $31,841, which is a 218% return. We also can see the annual dividend income, which is $1,100, and that's after 20 years, which is pretty good, just starting off with $10,000. And then if we scroll down even more, we can get a couple graphs that'll show you just the portfolio balance going up over time, being at that 31,000, and then how the dividend income increases year over year, all the way up to $1,000. And the longer that you keep your money into SCHD, the more exponentially the dividend income will go up. And I can actually show you that if we put in more years. So instead of 20 years invested, if you did 40, so let's say you started when you were 20 years old and invested into SCHD, and we can hit calculate, we can see that the ending balance goes up a lot to $101,000, but now the annual dividend income is $3,500. And if we look down, and here you can actually kind of see the exponential graph take effect, where at the beginning of the years, it kind of goes up slowly, but towards the end, we can see it exponentially increase. And that's just investing $10,000 in and having no monthly contribution to this account. And that is what SCHD has to offer. Now remember, I'm not telling you to buy or sell this ETF. I'm just giving you all the information that you need to see if this investment may be right for you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you were able to learn something from this video. And if you did enjoy this video, I made a couple other videos that I think you may like. That's it for now, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.